What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review of the Overture DLC for Lies of P, which was just recently announced and then immediately dropped at the Summer Games Fest about a week ago from the time of this video. I was a little busy at that particular moment, so it took me a little while to get around to it, but right after it was announced and released, the devs did send me over a review key for this DLC, so just getting that out of the way right now. And while the DLC does bring a host of things like an entire new area, new secrets, new story, new boss fights, all of the things you would probably expect, it also brings alongside it a very substantial patch that I would argue is almost more notable than the DLC itself, thanks to everything it adds, including both a little bit of content as well as things like quality of life changes, things I would have enjoyed the first time around, and some really useful features like colorblind mode. So we're going to divide this up into the patch and the DLC itself, and I'm going to first cover the patch as it's a little bit easier. So the little bit of content I mentioned is that once you've beaten the game at least once, you can actually activate what they call boss rematch mode, which is essentially what it sounds like. You can fight versions of the bosses you have fought previously, either 1v1, or you can take on a sort of gauntlet where you'll fight 3 bosses back to back, with things like your health and whatnot being limited, of course. Now, the other, perhaps more controversial change for a Souls-like is that the patch also added new difficulty modes, but it was interesting the way they did this in that there are basically 2 easier difficulties now. The default difficulty, or normal, what you would have beaten the game on if you've played and beaten it previously, is in fact the hardest difficulty available. This patch just added 2 easier difficulties to, of course, make the content easier to go through. Although I will say the DLC is challenging no matter how you slice it, and it's probably also worth a mention that with this change, allowing them to, of course, focus on various difficulties, it does mean that anything past a New Game Plus 4 is going to be more difficult. So depending on how much you want to play it, there should still be plenty of challenge available for those who enjoy that kind of thing, which given the nature of the game, I would imagine is at least a few people watching this video. But the rest of what is really noteworthy with that patch specifically mostly comes down to features and quality of life improvements. For starters, there's a colorblind mode that I mentioned. That's pretty awesome to allow more people to play the game in general, with the rest of the quality of life stuff really being just a lot of little UI tweaks and subtle changes that make the game just kind of better overall. For instance, and I do hate to say this out loud, but the game's P organ, which is, despite what your mind might go to, one of your main progression routes in that you upgrade your puppet's heart, previously required you to basically reset the entire thing. But now there's an option to just reset individual nodes of it and make it easier to adjust if you want to sort of respec. They also allow you to decouple dash and dodge in the settings or the controls, meaning that you no longer have to use the same button to run as you do to, say, dodge or simply get out of the way. They decoupled those 2 things. And then perhaps my favorite subtle change is that in the level up screen, you can now add the experience from your inventory, experience in this case being called Ergo, which, like most Souls-likes, can be picked up in item form at various places, and then you can activate that to, of course, give yourself experience to then level up with, and it keeps you from losing it when you die. Well, now you can just activate that and add it to your total directly from the level up menu, which was very convenient. And the rest of what is noteworthy were, again, just small changes. Like, for instance, now when you're changing your armor and stuff in your character menu, it will show you how it's going to adjust your total weight, which affects, of course, how well you can move. And they even made some UI tweaks to things like how quests appear in the sort of fast travel menu. So if you're unaware, the fast travel menu would actually mark when someone wants to talk to you, or if you had an item, you could give them that kind of thing, and it would tell you roughly where to go. They've updated that to make it even more accurate, basically, and make it more intuitive. But that's kind of what we're looking at for the base game patch, which does, of course, bring us to the DLC. Now, the Overture DLC content-wise is a prequel to the main game. If you are unaware or just simply forgot, the main game of Lies of P takes place on the island of Krot. However, we find it in the midst of what they call the puppet frenzy or puppet madness, I don't remember exactly, and I believe there's a plague going around as well that we have to get to the bottom of and solve. Well, the Overture DLC basically kind of explains the what and the how in the days leading up to that particular event. So basically, right as the island of Krot is in the midst of collapsing into the state we find it in when we play the game. Now, as with any Souls-like, a good question when it comes to DLC is how and when can you start it? Well, It is fairly late in the game, actually. You have to have made it to at least Chapter 9, which is getting close-ish to the end, and having restored the Stargazer at the hotel. Once you've done that, the opening to the DLC becomes available in one of the Chapter 5 areas known as the Malum District. There was a dilapidated Stargazer there, which, if you're also unaware, those are your fast travel points or your checkpoints, that kind of thing. And there was a broken down one in that district that just didn't really do anything. And now, once you've activated the DLC, you can go back here, bring in an item, and it will in fact open up for you, and you'll be transported to the Forgotten Time, which is where, of course, the rest of the DLC takes place. Now, if you're anything like me, you may have to get caught up with the controls and everything before you make it too far, but as soon as you arrive, you're thrown into the thick of it, with new areas like this broken down zoo, which brings all sorts of new enemies, many modeled of course after the various animals one might find in a zoo, only to then later on find a version of the Krot Hotel, which acts as your sort of home base in the main game as well. And you're going to run into familiar faces while you're at it, which form the bulk of like the secrets and side quests you can get up to during this DLC. And speaking of, there is a sort of point of no return for the DLC as well. Once you get right up to the final battle, you really need to have cleared out everything and solved all the side quests and stuff, as a lot of that becomes unavailable afterwards. Thanks to the new UI improvements, it's all very well marked and not all that difficult to find on your own, but it's been a week, so there are, of course, guides out there already for it. But it's worth a mention that, you do kind of want to try to do all of this in one go, especially with how late in the game the DLC actually starts. Now, in terms of the sort of base levels, discounting things like the boss fights, it's mostly probably what you enjoyed from the game. Interesting level designs, interesting places to explore with some brand new enemies to fight, moves to learn, things to counter, including some returning ones, so it's a little bit of a mix of having to learn new things and alongside a few enemies you'll probably know how to fight here and there. So in that sense, combined with the new secrets and special areas you might be able to find, including an optional boss fight that is a slightly altered version of one you'll remember from the main game, it's an enjoyable experience running through the areas, but as with any Souls-like, one of the big draws is of course the boss fights. Now this is where the DLC gets particularly fun, because not only are these fights very interesting in that they do different things, while also avoiding the sort of double phase mechanic that like every single main story boss had, where you would kill one version and then they'd get a whole second health bar after resurrecting, and it got kind of old. They managed to avoid doing that here outside of one instance where I think it was fair. I don't want to show too many of these guys off, simply because there are only so many of them to begin with, but the first major boss you fight, the Puppeteer of Death, was a very cool fight, and defeating that boss gives you the opportunity to pick up a claw weapon, which is new as a combat style. So outside of even just cool bosses to fight, you also get a whole lot of new ways to fight them. There's quite a few new weapons, including some new Legion arms being the mechanical arm that could perform various abilities based on which one you were using. One of the new ones is like just a straight up shotgun, as an example. But honestly, my favorite weapon addition by far kind of turned out to just be a bow you get really early in the DLC, which I found to be very useful in the sort of methodical clearing out of enemies on occasion. And I want to mention that specifically because, man, the enemies in the DLC hit like a truck. And so I would advise you to take your time in some of these areas as you get to grips with everything, which is probably as good a time as any to mention that the DLC itself, depending on you and how quickly you move through it, is probably going to be like a 10 to 15 hour experience for most people. And I think for that experience, what you're getting is basically just more Lies of P with more combat styles, different ways to play it, new bosses to fight, new content to see. In that way, I think it's very good and achieves what it set out to do, which was simply improve the game, I would imagine, especially alongside the base patch that everybody gets regardless. Now, what I love a little less, frankly, though, is the price itself. They are charging $30 US for this, which is half the price of the base game if you were unaware, and I'd simply be remiss not to mention that I honestly would have preferred it be like $20 instead. With that in mind, though, I do think the DLC is very good. The base game patch that comes with the DLC, I think, more than makes up for that, and I'm fairly certain it was confirmed that NeoWiz, the developer and publisher for this, is in fact already working on the follow-up game to what is, in fact, one of the better Souls-likes out there. So, to that end, I'm going to go ahead and give the DLC a buy. I enjoyed it quite a bit. And I think if you've got $30 and you really enjoyed the base game, chances are you'll probably enjoy this, which is, I think, pretty much everything I've got to say about this particular DLC. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.